On August 21st, 2002, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, commenced their investigation. The final report was released on October 26, 2005, producing over 10,000 pages.
It's funny they would name it the Report on the Collapse of the Twin Towers, because the report does not explain how the Twin Towers actually collapsed, claiming that it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after initiation was reached and collapse became inevitable.
What is important is what got the building to the point of collapse initiation. A major focus of our effort has been on trying to understand the entire process from the minute the airplane hit, all the way through the fires, and all the way through up to the point of collapse initiation.
10,000 pages, and not a single one to actually explain how the towers came down the way they did. NIST admitted in April 2007 that they are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse.
They depend on a professor, a civil engineering professor from Northwestern University, Dr. Bažant, who did an analysis where he claims a progressive collapse could collapse the building.
Their argument in this paper is that this upper block of floors acts as a tamper to push down, so it stays fairly intact as a tamper. Makes some sense, right? But wait a minute, how about Newton's third law, which says that if the upper block exerts a force on the lower block of floors, the lower block exerts an equal force, students, on the upper block, equal.
If, according to the pile driver theory, the top section here, say this is the 96th floor, should interact with the 94th floor and crush the 94th floor, then the 96th floor should be crushed as well. But in the pile driver theory, you imagine that this whole section goes all the way through all 90 floors and each time crushes the next floor. If you take two objects, which you can crush, and squeeze them together, you crush both of them. This is Newton's third law. You cannot have the same object with the same strength and softness crushing this object without getting hurt itself. It's physically impossible. The pile driver theory not only violates Newton's second law, which we'll see in a while, but it also violates Newton's third.
What many people don't realize is these buildings are built to handle several times the load above them. And in fact, in the towers, the perimeter columns could handle 5 times the load above them, and the core columns could handle 3 times the load above them. So that load above them, as you can see, had no chance to collapse the lower portion of the building, unless, and this is a big if, unless there was an impact with a deceleration. What happens there is the force is amplified, and it's amplified because the deceleration is many times the rate of gravity. What has to happen, though, and you heard me use the word deceleration, is that the impacting object has to decelerate. And when it decelerates, it loses velocity. Well, the drop of the upper section of the North Tower, or World Trade Center 1, has been measured by a large number of people now. There is no deceleration. The fact that there is no deceleration shows that there was no impulsive load or amplified load. Well, there's demolitions done in France which use what we call the vernage technique, where they take out a couple floors worth of columns with hydraulics. They take the columns out and they let the building, the upper section of the building, drop. And when it impacts the lower section, there's a very definitive, observable jolt, deceleration, and velocity loss. And you can see it in the graph. It is not there in the case of the North Tower. When you watch video closely, in the case of World Trade Center 1, you'll see that the upper section disintegrates itself. Its lower stories are breaking up before it even impacts the lower section. It appears to be a controlled demolition of its own of the upper section.
So then what is left? Where's this block, this tamper that's supposed to wipe out the lower floors? Sorry, it ain't there, you know.
The question that you're talking about is the 10 seconds of time, or approximately anywhere between 9 and 12 seconds or 15 seconds of time.
That's not an answer.
15 seconds is a lie.
That's not an answer.
That's
a lie.
It's the
That's innovation.
Folks, we're trying to conduct this in a reasonable manner. You've asked him a question. If you're not happy with the answer, you're not happy with the answer. But he's answered the question.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Like lava.
Like lava.
On a volcano.
One, we were down at the B1 level, and one of the firefighters said, I think you'd be interested in this, and they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
As well as the molten metal in the debris, it was also observed prior to the South Tower's collapse.
A lot of people have said, well, it was probably just aluminum from the airplanes, because aluminum melts at a relatively low temperature. It's like 600 centigrade. Basically what it comes down to is aluminum does not emit radiation very well, and so when you heat it up, it doesn't tend to glow very well. So the material that was flowing out of that building was not molten aluminum. Unless it was literally probably above its vaporization temperature, then maybe it would be hot enough to glow like that. But it just doesn't glow like that, so it wasn't aluminum.
We have a young professor here who came from NIST. He couldn't believe that NIST would say, if you mix organics with aluminum and pour it out, now it'll have an orange glow. He couldn't believe they'd be wrong, but we couldn't get it. So he was working with me for over an hour, mixing this concoction of molten aluminum with wood, glass, plastic, carpet pieces, mix, and it doesn't want to mix, that is, the organics don't want to mix with the molten aluminum. We just poured it out. He poured it out, actually. Silvery, not orange glow, no orange glow.
New York City, 2001. No tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to fire. But that's exactly what investigators believe happened to the 47-story World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11th.
The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
They have an elaborate theory. It's called thermal expansion. They say these beams expanded and pushed this girder off of its seat during this fire, which allowed the 13th floor to fall on the 12th, the 12th, and the 10th, etc., leaving column 79 unbraced for 9 floors, and then it just buckles. And then the whole inside of the building caves out. What's wrong with this theory? Well, first of all, the fire was out on this floor according to photographs that NIST provided over an hour before this collapse even happened. And yet the collapse is blamed on a current fire expanding these beams. Second, these beams don't elongate, they sag, as you saw in the Cardington test. Even if that would have happened, it wouldn't have pushed this girder off of its seat, because that girder is tied with shear studs to the concrete floor up above. According to NIST, it didn't have shear studs, which the construction documents show clearly that they did. We couldn't have had that girder falling off of its seat because these beams only expanded 3 or 4 inches, not enough to push it off of its seat on this column. But let's say it could have.
They claim that when the girder was pushed past center, when the web, the vertical part, was no longer over the seat, that the flange folded and the girder fell. Well, in the plans, they had flange stiffeners, a piece of metal welded to the web and to the flange, designed specifically to keep the flange from folding. And they left these flange stiffeners out. There is no chance this was a mistake. This was a deliberate fraud to make their collapse theory work.
This is the graph for the roofline of WTC-7. Note that for well over 2 seconds, the graph is linear, so the acceleration is constant. The slope of the linear portion of the graph is essentially equal to the acceleration of gravity within the margin of error of the measurements. In other words, for this building, even though it is falling straight down through its own supporting structure, free fall actually happened. Notice also that there's a sharp onset of free fall. The building is holding steady, then it simply lets go. A mass in free fall can do no work. And if something was being destroyed It's not being destroyed by the falling mass. It was destroyed to enable the mass to fall. The fact of free fall is literally proof of demolition.
We conducted the study without bias, with no preconceived notions about what happened. When we started the investigation, we considered a whole range of possible hypotheses. And from that, based on our technical judgment, we decided what were credible hypotheses that we should pursue further. We judged that other hypotheses that were possible hypotheses that were suggested really were not credible enough to justify a careful investigation.
An investigative reporter, her name is Jennifer Abel, called up the NIST spokesman, his name is Newman. She asked, what about the letter where NIST said it didn't look for evidence of explosives? See, they didn't even look. They admitted that finally in a letter. Newman, who's listed as the spokesperson, right, because there was no evidence of that, huh? Shh, go away. Abel, Jennifer, but how can you know there's no evidence if you don't look for it first? Good girl, that's it. Investigative reporting, let's find the answer. Newman, if you're looking for something that isn't there, you're wasting your time. Now, am I missing something here? I mean, this is offensive to my intelligence.
So the preconceived notion of NIST is that there's no evidence for explosives, and so there's no point in looking. That is the most unscientific thing that you can possibly think of, not to look because you don't expect to find evidence.
But fortunately, the dust was examined by independent scientists. Did you know that a peer-reviewed study was published in 2009 by a group of scientists revealing that a high-tech explosive called nanothermite was found in all dust samples? My name is Mark Basile. I'm a chemical engineer, and I began experiments with the World Trade Center dust in 2008. I found the red-gray chips referred to in that study. I witnessed low-temperature ignition of red-gray chips at 450 degrees C, resulting in molten iron droplets, and I conclude that the red layer in the dust particles is a nanothermitic material. Nanothermite in the dust should be a wake-up call to all of us. It doesn't belong there.
And despite all that, we still have these shills out there that want to suggest that these are paint chips.
You know, they say a picture speaks 1,000 words, and it really does. I mean, you can just see there's one of these things is not like the other, one of these things is not quite the same.